Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep, into the life of a fascinating figure, Dr. Manmohan Singh.
Definitely a figure that challenges our usual ideas about who ends up leading a country.
Right. I mean, from a village in pre-partition Punjab all the way to becoming the Prime Minister of India.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. And we're going to try to uncover, what shaped him, what were those defining moments and choices that led him there. And we've got a lot to work with. His biography, some of his economic writings, really gets into his thinking.
Excellent. Looking forward to digging in.
Yeah, me too. And even just glancing at his early life, one thing's clear. This guy was brilliant. First-class honors at Cambridge, then a DPhil from Oxford.
Those are not your average universities.
Not at all. The heart of economic thought globally. I mean, imagine the intellectual atmosphere he was in. Did those years kind of lay the foundation for the policies he'd later implement?
It's certainly possible. Think about the major schools of thought at the time. Was he influenced by, say, Keynesian economics? Or perhaps something else entirely?
And it makes me think about his early book, the one that critiques India's trade policies. He basically called out what he called the inward-looking approach.
Right. So for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, it essentially means a focus on protecting domestic industries, limiting imports.
Exactly. And it's interesting because this wasn't just some theoretical exercise. It foreshadowed the economic reforms he'd spearhead years later.
A shift toward liberalization, right? Opening up markets, almost like his academic work was directly linked to his vision for India's economic future.
Exactly. So we see that strong foundation in economics. But then he shifts gears a bit, moving beyond just the academic world. Joins the UNCTAD Secretariat, becomes Secretary General of the South Commission.
Roles that put him on a much larger stage, dealing with global issues, development challenges.
Totally. And that global perspective must have been so valuable. Almost like he was gathering the tools he'd need for something even bigger down the line.
Like a stepping stone.
It feels that way. And then, of course, we come to his entry into the Indian government. In 1991, the year he becomes finance minister, stands out. India was in a deep economic crisis at the time, a real turning point.
A make-or-break moment, it seems. Was this where all those years of preparation, that global experience, truly came to bear?
It's hard to imagine it not having an impact. The country was facing a balance of payments crisis, on the verge of default. And here comes Dr. Singh with his understanding of global economics, his belief in market-oriented reforms.
And he didn't shy away from bold action. He introduced a series of liberalization measures, reducing import tariffs, encouraging foreign investment, even starting to privatize state-owned enterprises, a real shakeup for India.
And this is where things get really interesting, right? Because these reforms weren't without controversy. Some argued they benefited the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Others felt they eroded India's self-reliance.
So how did he navigate those criticisms? How did he balance his belief in liberalization with, presumably, a desire for social equity?
That's a key question. And it seems like he truly believed that a growing economy would lift all boats, so to speak, that economic progress would lead to social progress. But balancing those priorities, market efficiency and social equity, that was the tightrope he had to walk.
And it's a debate that continues today. But there's no denying the impact of those reforms. India's economy opened up, growth rates soared, and the country became a major player on the global stage.
It's fascinating to think about the long-term consequences, both positive and negative. Did those reforms lay the groundwork for the India we see today? And what about the social costs, the inequalities that still persist?
Those are questions historians and economists are still grappling with.
Absolutely. So we have Dr. Singh, brilliant economist, reformer, who reshaped India's economic landscape. But then, in a twist that probably surprised many, this scholar, this technocrat, ascends to the highest political office in India, Prime Minister.
You don't often see that kind of trajectory. We think of politicians as politicians, not necessarily as intellectuals or scholars.
It makes you wonder how he navigated the world of politics, which can be so driven by personality and power plays. Was his intellectual background a help or a hindrance? Did he have to adapt, or did he stick to his principles, even if it meant clashing with the political establishment?
Those are questions we'll definitely be exploring as we delve deeper into Dr. Singh's journey from scholar to statesman.
Definitely a lot more to uncover.
So we left off with Dr. Singh taking on this incredibly demanding role, Prime Minister of India.
It really makes you think about the kind of person who thrives in that environment.
Right. And whether his background, all that academic and global experience, truly prepared him.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like he was completely new to politics. He'd been leader of the opposition,
Yeah.
participated in parliamentary debates.
Right, building coalitions, all that.
Exactly. So he wasn't a stranger to the political game, so to speak.
Makes you wonder, though, did he ever express any frustration with the political process itself? I mean, it can be pretty messy.
It's funny you say that because, yeah, some accounts do suggest he was frustrated at times, all the compromises, the backroom deals.
The horse trading.
Exactly. But he also seemed to believe that working within the system, even with its flaws, was the best way to get things done.
Pragmatic, I suppose. So specifically, what were his main goals during his time as prime minister?
Well, he served from 2004 to 2014, and throughout that time, he continued to emphasize economic growth, pushing for further liberalization, investing in infrastructure, but he also focused on social welfare programs, especially those aimed at reducing poverty, boosting rural development.
So trying to find that balance we talked about earlier between economic progress and social equity.
It seems that way, but was it even achievable? Some critics argue that his market-oriented reforms actually made inequality worse, that the benefits didn't reach everyone.
Yeah, that's a common critique of free market approaches. So how do we reconcile that with his commitment to social welfare? Did his policies reflect that commitment?
It's a tough question, and honestly, there's no easy answer. But it's worth noting that he did expand access to education and healthcare, implemented rural employment schemes, introduced programs like the National Rural Health Mission. Those things definitely had a positive impact on a lot of people.
Sure, but were they enough to offset the potential downsides of rapid economic change?
That's the debate, isn't it? It's a question that goes beyond just Dr. Singh and his policies. It's about the bigger picture, the relationship between economic growth and social justice.
A question a lot of countries are grappling with.
Absolutely. And it's within that complex context that Dr. Singh had to operate. Another thing that stands out is his leadership style, very different from what we usually associate with politicians. He was known for being soft-spoken, deliberate, almost professorial.
Right. I've heard he preferred reasoned argument over, fiery speeches.
Exactly. Some people saw that as a weakness, lack of charisma maybe, but others saw it as a strength.
Intellectual honesty, perhaps.
Yeah, like he was bringing the mindset of a scholar to the political arena. Instead of trying to rally the masses with emotion, he believed in well-crafted policies, backed by data, evidence.
And that approach worked for him sometimes. He built consensus, forged alliances, pushed through some major reforms, but it also had limitations. He was often criticized for being too detached, out of touch with the average person.
It's interesting, right? This leader who is deeply committed to improving people's lives, but sometimes struggled to connect with them on an emotional level.
It makes you think about what we really want in a leader. Do we need charisma? Or is there room for the quiet, intellectual type?
It's a good question, especially relevant today when we see such a clash between those different styles of leadership. And Dr. Singh's story, with all its complexities, offers a really interesting case study.
Definitely. And as we go deeper into his time as prime minister, we'll have to consider those specific challenges he faced, the successes, the legacy he left behind.
Yeah, it feels like we just scratched the surface here. So much happened during his time as prime minister.
Right. I mean, both in terms of achievements and the controversies, too. And I think to really understand his legacy, we have to look beyond just the economics.
Absolutely. Like, for example, the global financial crisis of 2008. That hit everyone pretty hard. How did someone with Dr. Singh's background approach a crisis like that?
Well, that's where his deep understanding of global financial systems really showed. He implemented policies that actually shielded India from the worst of it, kept things relatively stable when a lot of other economies were really struggling.
So, steady leadership in a turbulent time. But, alongside those global challenges, he also faced a lot of political storms at home.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Accusations of corruption within his government, criticism over his handling of certain policies, opposition parties were really putting on the pressure. And some people argue that his consensus-building approach, that quiet style, maybe it wasn't suited for those kinds of challenges.
So the very qualities that some admired, thoughtfulness, deliberation, maybe they were seen as weaknesses in that kind of environment.
Yeah, it's possible. It makes you think about how those expectations of leadership change, especially in a world that's constantly in flux.
It really does. But despite all that, despite the criticisms, the challenges, he served 2 full terms as prime minister. Beyond the economic reforms, what kind of lasting impact did those 10 years have?
Well, one area where his influence is undeniable is in India's foreign policy. He strengthened ties with countries like the U.S., but also really focused on building relationships with developing nations, especially in Asia and Africa.
So again, kind of a balancing act, like we saw with his domestic policies.
Exactly. He navigated those complex relationships, all those geopolitical currents, with a real emphasis on diplomacy and cooperation, always stressing dialogue, mutual understanding.
It seems like a consistent thread throughout his career, whether it was economics or foreign policy. He really tried to find common ground, build bridges, rather than resorting to, confrontation.
I think that's a fair assessment. And that approach, even though it might not always be flashy or grab headlines, I think it had a real impact on India's standing in the world.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I have to say, Dr. Singh's journey is truly remarkable, from that small village to the top levels of academia. From steering India through an economic crisis to leading the nation on the global stage. It's a story that's hard to categorize, full of contradictions.
It really makes you rethink those easy assumptions we have about leadership, about the relationship between intellect and power, and the role that scholars can play in shaping the course of a nation, even the world. Dr. Manmohan Singh's story is full of insights, but it also leaves us with a lot of questions. Maybe that's what makes it so fascinating.
I think you're right. And for our listeners, as you continue to explore and learn, I hope you'll think about which parts of Dr. Singh's story resonate with you. Do you see a place for his style of leadership in the world today? And how can we as individuals cultivate those qualities? The intellect, the integrity, that deep commitment to public service. These are questions worth pondering.
Absolutely. Because, understanding the past can often help us find our way forward. So until next time, keep diving deep and keep those minds engaged.